So it was great to go back this fall because I had.
You were back there.
I was back. I guess it's now alumni weekend.
Oh yeah.
Rhodes House.
Oh yeah.
They did unveiling of portraits.
Did they?
And I was very fortunate.
I was one of you there. Wonderful. That's congratulations. Rhodes.
Hello, my name is Sue Cunningham. I am President and CEO of CASE, the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, and it is my immense pleasure to welcome those in the room and those across the world to be joining us at American University here today. We're here today to talk about the need to claim our story, to emphasize the importance of higher education. As it happens, in 2018, we are celebrating the centenary of ACE, the American Council for Education, which formed in the year that the First World War reached its conclusion, when education was understood to be vital, reclaiming a shattered generation, rebuilding national economies, and repairing cultures. Universities in the UK and the US were highly regarded, and college education was acknowledged as an important building block to a productive life and career. It is fitting that we're holding this conversation at American University, which celebrates the 125th anniversary this year of its charter by the United States Congress, and New York University, which was conceived in 1831 and from the outset was established as a center of higher learning that would be open to all, regardless of national origin, religious beliefs, or social background. These institutions were created at a time of great ambition for the United States, when education was clearly viewed as a public good, and access to education for people beyond just the wealthy classes was an innovation. In the United Kingdom, Universities UK, ACE's UK counterpart, is also celebrating the centenary of its beginnings. And higher education in the US and the UK today still occupy the top of the world rankings, notwithstanding fierce competition from other parts of the world, where some governments we see are investing significantly in higher education. I would argue that we now find ourselves living in a time characterized by diminishing regard for many institutions, colleges and universities amongst them. And this is a deep reversal from the original story of many, if not most, higher education institutions in the United States. Just today, Inside Higher Education and Gallup have released their annual survey of college presidents, and the findings indicate that our conversation today is vital. Only 13% of college and university presidents agree that most Americans have an accurate view of the purpose of higher education, and just 16% say the public has an accurate view of the purpose of their sector of higher education. A recent Pew research showed that a majority of Americans no longer expressed a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. Gallup research suggests that political, cultural, and economic concerns are closely linked to this diminishing regard. In the Brexit campaigning in the United Kingdom in 2016, Michael Gove, who currently serves as the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and in the past served as Secretary of State for Education, complained, people in this country have had enough of experts, and that they should trust themselves. Recently, Florida Governor Rick Scott announced that we don't need a lot more anthropologists. At the same time, there are strong advocates who speak out in support of the importance of education and learning. Writer and actor Stephen Fry, for example, in the Fry Chronicles, argues that the only reason people do not know much is because they do not care to know. They are incurious. Incuriosity is the oddest and most foolish failing there is. Film director Ridley Scott, no relationship, I believe, to Governor Rick Scott, who was awarded the British Academy of Film and Television Arts 2018 Fellowship just last month, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award, focused his thanks unusually in an award speech upon his teachers and his education. And he said, "It's extraordinary what an enthusiastic teacher can do, drawing the student out, igniting independence and encouraging a design of your own future, rather than waiting for something to happen. Teaching is the most important of all professions. Sort that out, and social problems will get sorted out. Sounds simple, we've been talking about it for years, but it's absolutely vital." My personal experience of undergraduate study taught me many things, not least of which was the discovery of the joy of learning. I also discovered the inherent truth that my work there was an opportunity for me to grow and to develop and succeed in what I was passionate about. We also find ourselves in an era in this part of the world in which decreased government support is raising the cost of an education for students and families, and in which philanthropic support of educational institutions is becoming more and more essential. In the UK too, we are seeing greater participation and higher levels of private support than ever before. And in the US, philanthropic contributions to education totaled $43.6 billion, the highest amount ever in 2017. These philanthropists, from alumni contributing $5 or £5 annually to game-changing 9-figure gifts, all recognise the continuing importance of education to transform lives and society, and they are stepping forwards in unprecedented ways. Education's role in teaching people to think, to be curious, and to discern fact from fiction is more important than ever. Moreover, the research and knowledge leadership that comes from our colleges and universities has created whole new industries, increased productivity, improved our day-to-day experience, saved lives in our physicians' offices and hospitals, and given us new insights into our lives and those of our neighbours. This is not the first conversation of its kind, and it won't and mustn't be the last. What is important is that it is a conversation for those engaged in advancing the good work of our universities and colleges, the work our institutions do with students in life-changing research in service of our communities. At the same time, it is vital that this conversation goes far beyond our own community. We are here today to talk about why higher education matters, how we lost control of the story, and what we need to do to get it back. And today's panel brings great expertise to the conversation. It's my pleasure as President and CEO of CASE to be moderating today's panel. CASE has over 3,700 member institutions, schools and colleges in 82 countries around the world. And our work is really focusing on integrated advancement, which includes the disciplines of alumni relations, of communications, of fundraising, advancement services, marketing and public relations, providing our members with a unique place to frame the story for our institutions. And as the moderator of today's discussions, I am deeply honoured to introduce our panellists. First of all, our host today is Sylvia Burwell, President of American University. Sylvia became American University's 15th president in June of 2017. And prior to that, Ms. Burwell served as the president for the Walmart Foundation and served for 11 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She also served in the Obama administration as Secretary of Health and Human Services and Director of the Office of Management and Budget, as well as in a variety of roles for the Clinton administration. We are very grateful to Ms. Burwell and her team at American University for hosting this event today, and I would personally like to thank Terry Flannery, American University's Vice President for Communication and longtime CASE board member and volunteer, for her leadership in planning today's event. Danielle Douglas-Gabrielle, Education Finance reporter for the Washington Post, has been with the Post since 2009, covering both education and the finance industry, with degrees from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University and from New York University. Ms. Douglas-Gabrielle has a great deal of experience in the education sector, providing both a personal and professional perspective to her coverage of education finance, the student loan industry, the Department of Education under Secretary DeVos, and related topics. Her recent articles have covered Trump administration calls for cuts to student aid programs, court rulings related to state filings against student loan contractors, and the relationship between states and for-profit higher education providers. Andrew Hamilton became president of New York University in January 2016. Previously, Dr. Hamilton served as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Oxford, where I had the honour of working with him. President Hamilton is not new to US higher education. He served as Provost of Yale University, in addition to other senior administrative and faculty roles at Yale, Princeton, and the University of Pittsburgh. A chemist by training, he continued his scholarly work, including an active research laboratory, while holding leadership positions. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And Ted Mitchell, who joins us, has been the President and CEO of the American Council on Education since September 2017. ACE is the major coordinating body for America's colleges and universities, advocating at the federal level on behalf of higher education and providing a range of services for colleges and university leaders. Prior to becoming president of ACE, Dr. Mitchell served as U.S. Undersecretary for Higher Education at the U.S. Department of Education in the Obama administration. In that capacity, he oversaw all post-secondary education policies and programs. Prior to entering the Obama administration, he served as CEO of New Schools Ventures Fund, President of Occidental College, and Vice Chancellor and Dean at the University of California, Los Angeles. Can I ask you to join me in welcoming all of our speakers? So before I ask my first question, can I remind you that those in the room have the opportunity to ask questions using the live website, and that those who are joining online can do so and do so through Twitter as well, using hashtag #WithHigherEd. So welcome to everybody here. And if I can, Sylvia, may I start with you as our host today? You started in your current role, as I said earlier, just very recently, and have undertaken a listening tour. So what have you heard on your listening tour?
So I've heard a lot about American University, and welcome to everyone to American University. We're so happy to be able to host this important conversation. Heard a lot about the university, but in terms of the broader issues that I've heard about, I would put them in 4 categories. The first is what I would say is I've heard a lot about the question of the value proposition, and how I would articulate that. That's about the economics of higher education. That is about how we price what we cost, because there's difference in terms of price and cost, and what we are offering in terms of what does it mean to have a degree from our institutions. What is the value that we add? And that involves many pieces and parts, everything from student loan debt to others. So heard that category. Second, heard quite a bit about issues around the future of work and how that relates to us, and have heard the spectrum of that conversation, from questions about what does artificial intelligence mean, what does it mean that people will switch jobs 15 times, and how does that relate in a positive way to the question of a liberal arts education and problem solving and critical skills. A third category that I've heard a lot about is the future of learning. And having been a gal who spent lots of time in the stacks, that is just one way that our students learn very, very differently in open areas, in groups. It's about the actual learning in terms of flipped classrooms, but it is also what learning means today in terms of, I think we'll probably talk about it here, the question of lifelong learning, the question of learning in bits related to issues like credentialing. The fourth category I've heard a lot about would be what I would consider the issues that are most important or at the fore of our campuses today, and to be specific about that, issues like inclusion and diversity and freedom of expression.
Thank you very much. Ted, can I ask you, in your first few months out there talking to many, what have you been hearing?
Listening tours are all the fashion for us newbies on the job, and I include myself. And absolutely down the line with Sylvia's observations. So just add a couple more. Our membership, Sue, as you mentioned, is quite broad. So we represent 4-year institutions, 2-year institutions, public institutions, private institutions, and a handful of responsible for-profit institutions as well. And so when we talk to the broad, and when I've been out talking to the broad membership, one thing that I would add to that is a mismatch in the way we both imagine higher education and the way we build policy for higher education between an image that we have of 18-year-olds getting dropped off at the front door of a campus with the expectation that they're going to leave 4 or 5 years later with a degree. Mismatch between that view and the wild diversity that is now the majority of the post-traditional student body. And so a sense that one of the things, and we will talk about this, one of the things that is driving this narrative is not just misinformation, but it is the sector as a whole struggling to match up what we do, or what we could do, given new learning modalities and so on. Matching that up with the 22-year-old returning veteran, the 30-year-old single mom, the 50-year-old who is coming back between jobs 13 and 14 for retraining. And so that I would add that to the conversation as well. The second thing that I'll say is there is a bit of angst about how we got here among university and college and community college leaders across the country. So you asked the question at the beginning about how we let this get away from us. And I think that there is a sense, and it was brought to the fore in not just the election, but some of the actions of state legislatures before that, that somehow we'd suddenly found ourselves on the wrong side of this issue, when I think we all came into this business because we believed, and still believe, that we're on the right side of this issue. And what we work for and toward for our institutions, our students, and our communities is nothing short of the health of our economy, individual opportunity, social equity, and the preservation of a great democracy. And so figuring out how to not just get us on the right side of that debate, but to encourage the broader public to recall those things is really compelling to our members and to the leaders across the sector.
Andy, you returned to this land recently from the United Kingdom. What most strikes you after 7 years in the UK about the narrative here?
I think the important thing to say, and you touched upon it, Sue, in your introductory remarks, is that this is actually a conversation. This is a debate that's taking place in many countries around the world. The United Kingdom, as many in the room may know, is just going through a root and branch review of higher education and how it's funded. The Australian system is going through real angst and introspection about the nature of the funding structure. In a very different way, countries like France, Germany, and Italy are also looking at their higher education systems. In a sense, they have a very different structure, much more open, very little selectivity for students going to university. But there, the challenge is, how do we ensure that universities are world class? How do we ensure that in the rankings and in the impact that universities are having on their societies, that they continue to be very effective and strong? And so the Excellence Initiative in Germany and France, for example, are both places where those countries are looking at their system and asking, how can it be better? How can it improve for the challenges of the 21st century? So as we think about this conversation, I do think it's important to recognize it's happening everywhere. I also think it's important to realize that there isn't one story, claiming the story. You know, that this is particularly in the United States, comparing to the UK and other European countries. There is not one story. The higher education ecosystem in the United States is a very large and a very varied one, and you know, it's the story we're talking about. The the research-intensive universities like Yale, Harvard, NYU, American, the great state institutions of the land. Is it a debate about our community colleges, the great city colleges like CUNY, the work from Raj Chetty recently, the economist Raj Chetty, showed how critical those universities are for economic and social mobility. Or is it a conversation about Trump University and other private, less responsible, for-profit institutions? Each story is different. Each story is very important as we debate how higher education can be better positioned, can better respond to the negative public perceptions that we're hearing about. But I do think it's dangerous for us to think that there's a simple answer that will solve these problems.
Danielle, you've been writing in recent days about the for-profit sector. What are you hearing as a journalist, and to what extent does it match what you're hearing from your fellow panelists?
I think there is a conflating of all of the diversity within the higher education sector, and there's a kind of a painting of a very broad brush of what higher education means in America. And it's important to note that there's a difference between the community college, the for-profit college, the state university, the regional public university, and the flagship, and their resources, and their ability to meet workforce needs in different segments. I will say one thing that I hear often from readers, which is really disappointing, is there is this perception that because of the investment that needed to go to college, especially if you want to get a traditional four-year degree, that somehow that money means that it must translate into a job that pays as much as quickly as possible without recognizing the importance of the education. I guess I'm thinking of the idea that as much as, of course, you want to make sure that we have a workforce that is prepared for the future of work, the changing nature of work, you want to make sure that you also have a citizenship that is prepared to be productive members of society. And I always thought that college at its best married the two. And somehow that's kind of gotten away from us. And I do wonder how much of that is because of the amount of money we are asking families to invest in the education, and them now seeing college as a commodity rather than as a social good. And I feel like a lot of that's being reflected in some of the state policy and the federal policy that we're seeing.
I'm seeing many. Any responses to that? Yeah, Ted.
Could I just pick that up, because I think that that's exactly right, Andy. To your point, it is, and this is one of the places where this narrative question comes home to roost, is that we understand very well the diversity of institutional forms and missions, and yet there is a real sense among college goers and their families that it's just one thing. We've done a lot of focus group work of late. I'm trying to get underneath this, and the commodification is quite real. And the image is that you go to college to learn stuff to get a job. And around that, citizenship, a sense of curiosity and self-purpose, it's really absent. And I think it's partly about the cost. And I also think that there are deep wounds in the public mind from the Great Recession, where suddenly things weren't paying off the way they were supposed to be paying off, and people who were doing the right thing weren't ending up where they thought that they were going to end up. And so there is the cost piece, and then there is a sense of almost injustice that the system isn't paying off the way they thought it was going to.
Can I say one thing? I think it's interesting, and I feel like it's important for schools to continue to hammer into students that your career isn't just the first 3 years out of college. Okay? Your earning potential, I mean, if it was, my God, I'd be living in a box. But, you know, your career is the longevity, and there's continuing education all throughout. And the foundation of your education is supposed to help you at all those stages. And somehow that message is lost when we continue to think of a college degree as an immediate commodity.
Yeah. Can I just add to Danielle's point, because it's something that I say every year to parents considering their children coming to NYU, is that our responsibility indeed is to help those students prepare for their first job. It is an important responsibility of any university to prepare students for the world of work. But just as we prepare them for their first job, it's our responsibility to prepare them for their fifth job, that they will get 20, 30 years from now in an economy, in a world that we can't possibly predict. And so the fundamental principles of mental dexterity, of critical thinking, of of expression in writing or in speaking, these skills of adaptability for a world that we can't know what it will look like are critical parts of the education that Danielle so eloquently describes. And again, that message is something that we need to be presenting ever harder and stronger.
So I bet you thought you were going to be able to ask more than one question. And to build on that, I think what we're seeing in our surveys and focus, and it goes back to the point that Sylvia was making about lifelong learning and about the changing world of work and the dexterity that's needed, is that we're seeing that going in this direction, which calls on a broadening of how we think about certainly the undergraduate experience, whether it's 2-year or 4-year, at precisely the same time that the public argument is going in the other direction about narrowing and focusing and creating job-ready skills for that first job, with far less concern about the second, third, or fourth job.
Although I do think it is important, and I think it's important in this conversation to take a step back about the question of it. It is framed in terms of the topic of the panel, and I understand from a case perspective about the story and the narrative, and that implies that it is about how we communicate facts, and that there might be a disagreement in facts and substance, and that if we could communicate that would be what we need to do. And I actually would like, I don't mean to be a skunk at the garden party, but I actually think it is important for us to reflect on the reality of why people feel that, and think about what we are getting right and getting wrong. So let's just follow this path and this conversation about this question. So we're all, yes, it is about that 20 years from now, 25 years from now. But how do we as institutions think about, for those people who don't complete the degrees and come out with the debt, because we have embraced this 4-year thing, 5-year, however many it takes, as the thing, as the definer. And so what that means in today's society, marketplace, questions of citizenship. And so I just would posit that I think it's important for us as a sector to think about, go to the next order question of, there is generally truth in certain criticisms when in any sector, and either it's a question of we don't have the same facts, or perhaps there is something that we're not getting.
So Sylvia, what do we need to do to change? I mean, in your first response, you outlined 4 very clear areas, and we've come back to lifelong learning already. But what can we palpably do? What can American University do in this space?
So I think we can do a number of things. And if we start with that first question, I actually think the way to kind of go, we've identified, I think, pretty clearly the areas that people are focused on, and you take them one by one, and you examine what is the substance of the concern and what is the differential in fact. One becomes a communication issue, the other becomes, oh my, there's something we need to do. Let's take economics, the value proposition. So that is a part of what's driving some of this. And so one of the things, in coming new to higher education, a question I ask everyone is, can you explain to me why our inflation rate is higher than core inflation? I came from the healthcare, as Secretary of Health and Human Services, spent a little time in a sector where that's true. And why do we answer that question, and how do we answer that question? Because this gets to our cost and our price. And thinking about that, and is it a question of it's a problem, we're not doing something right, that we have higher inflation, or is it that we do not articulate it? And then the other side of that equation, which is the value proposition, and this does back into market differentiation among different, and I know market is a dangerous word when we talk about higher education, but the institutions are different in terms of who they're serving, in terms of what we're trying to do. We're all trying to make good citizens. We're all trying to do that core thing, but how we go about doing it is different. So are there things we should do and think about differently? And that does come to the issue of what is the value of how we think about a portion or a part of a degree those are questions that I think are some of the substantive questions that we should think about, and you can go area by area and break it into, is this a communications issue? The other thing, in that space, I believe there are communications issues. I don't know why our debt gets compared to credit card debt.
Mhm.
I don't know why, because the value of this is something that keeps on. It's not a consumption issue. It is something that grows
An
over
investment.
time. It's an investment. Should it be more like your healthcare debt? Or should it be more as we talk about it? And so I think there are communications issues that have to do with facts and comparison, but I actually think there are substantive issues as well.
And Danielle, just can I bring you in on what Sylvia just posited around it being seen in the same context as credit card debt, or I mean, what?
I mean,
Do you
you
have a
know,
take on that?
ideally, you realize that an education is far more valuable than anything you can purchase on a credit card. But when you are making a monthly payment and your servicer is calling you and they want that money, and you have rent and groceries and everything else to pay, it's going to feel the same way. And when there's the possibilities of your wages getting garnished and all of the other things that can come with being delinquent or defaulting on a federal loan or a private loan, it doesn't feel any different. And that is, I think, the reality for a good number of Americans. And they feel I can understand that a lot of universities don't understand that even though that their education is very valuable, the hardship of trying to pay it off when you don't come from a family that has resources, when you don't have any backup, or when you struggle the first 3 or 4 or 5 years out of college, it doesn't really change anything for you in terms of how you're perceiving that debt.
And again, your writing it identifies certain sectors where that this is a greater source of anxiety than others in terms of
Sure.
what we've talked about the broad.
I mean, I think
variance of higher
it's
ed.
important that we be very clear about student debt, right? The large percentage of people having 6-figure debt and stuff, these oftentimes are a very small percentage. Plus, they're graduate students. Graduate students tend not to have high default rates. They're not where the greatest concern should be placed. Though the cost of graduate education, of course, is a great concern for many people, especially for folks who do not have the resources to afford it from the front, and then also who are facing the fear of kind of an onslaught on graduate education right now. If you think about the tax bills, if you think about some of the state and federal policies trying to change the way graduate schools are paid for. But then you really think about where the concentration of debt is, right? It's a lot of for-profit colleges. Students tend to take on the highest amounts of debt, and even if it's not a high amount of debt, that money is still difficult to pay if you don't have gainful employment in order to afford it. But I gotta say, regardless if it's a 4-year or 2-year or any other type of iteration of college or university, there needs to be a recognition of the difficulties students have sometimes paying for their degrees, and at least some kind of empathy. And I don't always see that in many of the administrators I speak to at these various schools.
Well, let me respond, and I think Danielle is absolutely right. We do need to look very hard at our cost structures. We do need to look very hard at NYU. We've focused over the last couple of years on an affordability initiative to keep costs down, to find routes for students to get their degree at lower cost with opportunities for lower room and board expenses in a city like New York. But also, this debate is happening at a time where certainly among the top 40, 60, 100 universities in this country, there has never been more committed to financial aid. There have never been more generous financial aid packages among some of the leading universities. Those can be even far into middle class incomes. And so, should we be doing more? Absolutely. Should we be focusing on keeping our costs down? Absolutely. But this is happening at a time when universities, of course, recognize the impact on their students and are showing that through their financial aid budgets.
Ted, thinking about, and we have two of the leaders on our panel, how is it that the leaders of our educational institutions, and we've talked already about there being a huge variety of types of higher education institutions, but what in your conversations are you posturing as the things that they may need to be focusing on, may need to adapt in this current narrative?
So going back to Sylvia's good, helpful distinction between communications issues and substantive issues, I think that leaders are recognizing both. One of the things that drew lots of us to higher education is fealty to fact and evidence and data, and I think we all retain that. It turns out that that's pretty compelling to all of us, but is not in itself evidence for lots of people who are acting, whether they're parents or students. And so we need to get better at telling our story and then backing it up with evidence, and that's the communication side. And so the leaders that we're talking to are keenly aware of that and looking for avenues. Be very interested in the folks who are joining us online for them to talk a little bit about the ways that they're trying to do that. So that's one side. But I think that there is a recognition that there are substantive issues that we need to work on. So doubling down in institutions where there are resources on financial aid, saying to families whose incomes are below a certain level, you will be debt-free or tuition-free. Those are important messages, and they're not really getting out yet. But that's a substantive response to the issues of cost and price, and I think it's really important.
Can I disagree with that? Because even though we so often agree, I think we are getting those messages out, and I think you can see that we do have a problem. In my view, it's principally a political problem that higher education has become now, in these last years, a political football here in the US and indeed in the UK. But take a moment to reflect on that most important issue for all universities, which is the applications for future undergraduate students. I know NYU's numbers, and this year for attending as undergraduates this coming summer, our applications went up by 12%, up to 75,000 applications. And I'm sure similar numbers were seen at AU, similar numbers have been seen in universities around the country. So at that point where it truly matters, when families are making a decision, should their children go to college or not, they are recognizing what we all know, that it's never been more important to have a college degree for a prosperous, successful life. That being said, we still have a problem, and the problem is a political one, where we are finding universities being, to some extent, used as a political football. We've seen it in this country on both sides of the mainstream aisle. We see it in the UK with the Corbyn opposition government proposing to do away with tuition fees. And these are things that we have to double down on the value proposition, as Sylvia has said. But where it matters most in our application numbers, those have never been stronger.
And we have to be very careful to make sure that as we dissect those application numbers, that the messages that low income, first generation students of color are welcome on our campuses are heard loud and clear. We've all read Caroline Hawksby's research on undermatching. We've seen the Chetty research on the volume of applications and how that translates into actual enrollment. I think we need to, Andy, I don't disagree with you that's an incredibly powerful marker of broad perception of the value of higher education. And as institutions, Sue, to your question about how institutions are responding, being more careful and more analytic about how that's distributed is one. And I do have to say, to Sylvia's other point, I do think that we have a completion problem. And it is at the root of the student debt problem, and it's twofold. 100% of students who enroll at AU or NYU or LaGuardia Community College, 100% of them want to finish their program, but only 60% do. And we have a responsibility to that 40%, and that's either getting them through the programs as they're designed now, or thinking, as Sylvia pointed out, of whether we can think about different markers of completion that can provide a packaging of skills, attitudes, and ideas that could be a completion of a different sort. But that's a problem that really is corrosive of the public trust. It is corrosive in our own institutions in terms of churn and turnover, and it's corrosive in the lives of the students who don't
So
get through.
I've got a question for Danielle, but can I bring you in first, Sylvia? So
It's just, as we think about the question of, is it a political problem, I just think, coming back to Danielle's point, as we think about there's our interactions with the capital cities in our nations, but then there's our interaction with the public more broadly. And I think Danielle's point about how it feels, if you're one of those students, and many of them sometimes are non-traditional students who have made that investment and aren't seeing that benefit and having that debt burden and the stress of that debt burden, or even, so that's at one particular end of the spectrum, where let's just take a family that makes $125,000 in a year and think about what their take-home pay is, and let's just call education at one of the, institutions $60K all in. What does that feel like, and how do they think about that? And so I just think as we have the conversation, sitting in those seats and hearing and understanding, and then the so what of that becomes, okay, does this cost too much? And this is why I'm so interested in understanding what does it really cost and why, and really understanding that. So is the problem that it costs too much, or is the problem who is paying for it as a nation in terms of how we value it? And I actually think one of the ways we're going to have to work through this over time is getting to the real questions. And certainly the UK is in a situation perhaps where it's reversing how it historically thought about these questions. So to your point that everybody's thinking about the questions, but I think pushing ourselves to think about the real deal issues, and is it that this costs too much? And then you get to, well, we are paying a lot more in financial aid because we all are seeking to diversify socioeconomically, all kinds of ways, and often that costs more money. When those first gen students come, how we make sure they succeed and get to completion can cost. How we think about regulation of government and our costs. How we think about the question of what the student needs coming in and going out, e.g., we spend a lot more on mental health now than we historically did. And this question of going out and preparing them both to be a citizen and work, we believe in experiential learning. All of us do it, and we spend a lot of money. So getting to the real deal specifics and analytics around what this costs and where we go, I think is an important part of moving towards a solution.
And on this very subject, we've had a question here, which Danielle, I'd like your perspective on. How do we engage with those people here and elsewhere who may have an eroded perception of education? How do we set out on the journey to rebuild that trust and sense of value?
I think there are some practical things that are as simple as remembering the professor or the teacher who made the most difference in your life. Because I realize that for a lot of folks, the thinking of the institution is one thing, but thinking of the actual individual relationships they've had at various schools changes their perception of their experience. Then they start thinking about, oh, well, there was that one professor who did give me extra time, to finish this exam, or helped me a lot with this, or any of those kinds of things kind of ingratiate the students to their actual experience in college. And so that's important. I think to Sylvia's point of also kind of addressing those concerns by reminding folks of what it actually takes in order to produce this education for you. All the investments we're making in mental health, all the investments that the college is making in your counseling. I think there are a lot of universities right now, and I see this at community colleges as well as regional state schools, that are really smart in how they pinpoint when students most need help with counseling and services. And some of that's because they have performance-based funding and they feel very much incentivized to do so right now. Other reasons is just because they see their population. They recognize that they're not necessarily dealing with the 18-year-old fresh-faced kid coming out of high school. They're dealing with single parents. They're dealing with sometimes homeless students. They're learning to be more adept at having wraparound services to address the needs of these populations. And I think that's worth applauding, and it's also a story worth telling. And not a lot of times these folks, because they're in the trenches, aren't always the ones telling those stories. So as much as they can kind of praise themselves for that, I think it would change the public perception of what universities are there for, because a lot of them are doing amazing work right now.
And an interesting sort of angle on this, we've had a question, and I guess in my own mind, I'm wondering if the question is the right one. Ted, can I ask you to start off with this one? How do we make sure that all our stakeholders are on the same page for telling our story, i.e. faculty, staff, alumni, and so on? I mean, I guess there is a question is, do we want everyone to be telling the same story? But how, if we do we make sure they're on the same page?
Yeah, so we can turn Tolstoy on his head and say that every successful college is successful in its own way, and so probably needs to have its own storytelling. But I think it's important, and as a sector, Andy mentioned this. The American higher education sector is broad, it's diverse, and I think there will never be a one-size-fits-all playbook. But I'm looking at Tim McDonough. The Association of Governing Boards has a terrific project called the Guardians Project, in which they are creating tools for trustees of universities and colleges, both public and private, to be able to talk about some of these high-level, sector-level virtues of higher education, whether it's the long-term economic security for individuals, whether it's the preparation for a dynamic changing economy, whether it's good citizenship and wellness. I think that there's a skeleton that we're working on in a variety of ways, and I think that AGV's given us a good start. I hope that the conversation, Sue, that you're putting together here can give us sort of legs on the next part of that journey, thinking about alumni associations, thinking about communications directors, advancement people. These are critical messengers, whether that's at the campus level or at the institution level. And at ACE, we stand ready to try to help all of our member associations figure out what the right lane markers are for you all, and to then coordinate those in a way that has a maximum impact.
Thank you. A question, we've seen over recent decades a real growth in the number of people having ambitions and entering into higher education, and as Ted has said, the completion rates are not consistently what we'd want them to be. Have we actually exceeded what was reasonable? Are too many people aspiring now here and elsewhere to have a higher education experience?
Let me start on that. I think it would be a very sad day indeed in a civilized society when we start putting restrictions on education, when we start limiting access to education. For me, this is one of the great strengths of America. It's one of the great strengths of Western Europe, that we open opportunities to students, all students who wish to, not all do, but who wish to pursue higher education of some kind, and then higher education as potential preparation for the world of work. I also think it's been touched upon by Sylvia earlier on, the other dimension that we should also not underestimate is the changing longevity of society. You know, the 18-year-olds coming into AU and NYU in September, they will live, a very, very large proportion of them will live into their mid-90s. They may well work until their mid-80s to pay for all of our pensions, but they will certainly be living long lives. And that they spend some years in their late teens, early 20s in education that will then feed the life of the mind for their later years, to me is a very desirable thing. And so I become chilled, I will say, when I listen particularly to politicians who talk about restricting the number of students who go to college, or channeling people into particular other sorts of of outcomes. And I think for me, this is something that we should be proudly opening and promoting, that university, college is a route to a productive and a contented life.
Absolutely. I don't think we should limit it. I completely do not think we should limit it. I think Margaret Spellings had an interesting piece recently in the Chronicle about this very question and how it's definitional to us as a country. And, whether it's the changes that we made with the GI Bill in terms of expanding a huge population who would come, and other changes we've made throughout our history as a nation, but, from a perspective of the whole world, embracing that this is something. But I think what we need to do is, it does come back to, what does that mean? And we, I'm new to the space, but it feels like we have held this approach, this 4-year degree, both in terms of this lifelong learning and how we're going to think about it, that people are not going to be one and done. We came from a generation of pretty much one and done. It is the unusual person that I met yesterday in an event who told me, I came to American University when I was 50 and got my master's, a mother. And, that was an unusual thing, whereas I think the reality of the world we're going into is a flow. It's going to be much more of a flow. And so what we have to do is think about in the future, how do you create flows and credentials or recognition of the value and the creation of the curriculum that does two things? And it comes back to Danielle's point. It does two things. It's both about how you learn the things you need to be a good citizen, to be a community member, to do that, because that is a part of the value of education, as well as how you are able to support and fulfill your life through meaningful engagement in work or art or whatever that is. And so we get people, so we need to think about, we've done it a traditional way. And I think that's the place where we need to do good thinking and good changing, and it's hard. I understand it's very hard, because all of our structures and everything is set up this way, including our calendar, based on a farm calendar. Like, that's not with us anymore. So, so how do we think about, it's something as simple as that, as a structure that locks us in, and then everything, all our IT systems, right? To change all the systems to undo that. But I think that's what it's going to take to get to this different place.
And we've had a slightly different take on this, which is an economic one in a question. So what about the states where there are simply far too many colleges for the population? The questioner goes on to say, it seems some of these schools, some of which are really struggling in my state, will eventually have to close or merge. So what do we do about oversupply?
So from a sector point of view, oversupply is a transportation willingness to move issue. Nationally, we don't have an oversupply. There are some pockets where it feels like there is an oversupply of seats for students who are willing to do the traditional thing and go to a small liberal arts college for 4 years. I think that those are the institutions that maybe first can start to think about new ways of doing what they're doing to think about their offerings in a different way. I think that it is true that there are colleges that are struggling, and it is true that not all colleges will survive. But I'm not a Clay Christensen apocalyptic, saying that 25% of colleges and universities will disappear in the next 20 years. I don't think that that's true, but I think that they will evolve, and encouraging evolution is worthy of us. We just have to keep our eye on the quality bar as we do so. And I think one more thing. I think, again, the oversupply is if you focus on, I'll be more specific, is if you focus on the 18 to 22-year-old population. There is not an oversupply of higher education if you think about 32 to 62. Just the opposite. There is a huge undersupply, and the mechanisms to be able to serve that population are not as advanced as they ought to be.
I think some states are starting to think about that. If you look at Tennessee right now, expanding out its College Promise Scholarship to older populations, recognizing that there is a large swath of the population that really wants the access to education, who traditionally has been ignored by a lot of universities, regardless of the type, whether it's a 4-year or 2-year. They're just not the ones that people think of, but they are a part of that continuing education, and they do want access in the same way that an 18-year-old would. And so the more that we see states, especially Tennessee, because it's a Republican state, and they're becoming a model for what state partnerships with higher education could look like, regardless of the politics. The success of that could be replicated elsewhere and could really kind of change the sector as a whole, because there are schools that are struggling, and if they are able to have those kinds of relationships with their state government and start to kind of change the way that they perceive themselves within their community, that can mean a lot for a lot of those schools in terms of their sustainability.
Just one more add-on. So Danielle's exactly right. And I think Tennessee and other states like that are taking the lead. I think this is a place where we also need to think about not only the inflexibility of IT structures, where registrars' heads explode if you say, I want to have flexible courses that start every Tuesday and end 3 weeks later. I get that. My head would explode too if I were responsible for that. But there are also deeply embedded public policy issues about how we think about federal financial aid, how we think about state financial aid. And so it's age limits, it's quarter limits. I think if we're going to be serious about helping institutions, we need to dig in there as well.
Thank you. And Danielle, you provided a beautiful segue into a next question from somebody who's joined us online. What is the impact of federal and state policy and the environment we're in on the perception of higher education?
I mean, it's an amazing time right now because it's the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. We saw the House put forth the PROSPER Act at the end of the year, and there's quite a lot in there. It's about 530 some odd pages. I got through most of it. And it's interesting because there are two things happening. There is the federal government seeming to, or at least Congress wanting the federal role in higher education financing to change. There's lots of limits on how much parents can borrow, graduate students can borrow. There's changes in the repayment plan structure to the detriment of a lot of graduate students. There's also a great shift in thinking about what education should be. There's a lot of emphasis on career and technical education, which is not a bad thing, but the ways in which this could come about could be detrimental to some populations if we're not very thoughtful about how we move in those directions. I think the interesting thing will be to see what the Senate version looks like. There tends to be a little bit more bipartisan work around in that part of the world, but I think it's really important for all of higher education, all of its stakeholders, to pay very close attention to the details of a lot of the provisions that are proposed in the reauthorization bills.
I wonder if
Well, certainly at this moment we do need, as we've been talking this morning, to reclaim the story, to be making very strong, very public arguments why higher education matters, why graduate education matters, why we need trained engineers, trained doctors, why we need well-trained business people and legal minds as well. These are all things that depend upon a loan structure, and in the case of the Higher Education Bill, a public service loan repayment as well, that certainly for all of us would be very detrimental were it to change significantly. And again, making the argument, pushing the political buttons to be sure that we explain why higher education and continued strengthening and even expanding of that higher education is critical for American society.
So can I throw one in? I think it's I think that's exactly right, and I think from a perception point of view, I think it is more than ironic that at a time when the public is really concerned with cost and price issues, that both the tax bill and the PROSPER Act did one thing overwhelmingly: made college, university, and graduate school more expensive. 12 million students take advantage of the SEOG program. 12 million students would see the cost of their education rise. More than that for the in-school interest subsidy issue. And so on the perception side, I think for people who are trying to keep up with this, all they're seeing is that state disinvestment is making college more expensive. Now the federal government is piling on to make college more expensive. And I think for the people, we care a lot, all of us care a lot about all of our students, but we care about first-generation college students being encouraged to take advantage of colleges and universities, low-income students, students of color. These are the people who are going to see each of these as still one more chop at their legs as they're trying to move forward.
And Sylvia, I mean, you've lived this from the government side. As Secretary of Health and Human Services, amongst other roles, higher education and the federal government are obviously intertwined in complex ways. Is the relationship working right now?
I think is the relationship working? I think probably both sides would say not as much as it should, and so therefore, why is that? And I think breaking that down into its parts in terms of what creates a relationship. So part of what creates a relationship is actually trust and faith in each other and trust. And I don't know that that exists at the level that it should. And I would suggest that one thing we all need is to reflect on our rhetoric, because that is one of the things that reduces trust, at least in my experience in negotiating across the aisle with, you know, whether it's Republican governors or Republican Congress when I'm a Democrat and representing, or any kind of negotiation one does anywhere. Trust is at its core, getting to yes. So this question of how we think about our rhetoric and from higher ed's perspective and how the government thinks about its rhetoric, and thinking about, what are the steps we can do to build trust? Because relationships are important to getting solutions. So I think that's a place where I would very specifically focus. The second is finding the core areas of substance that we can work on together. I mean, one we just did, and this is extremely important for, I think many people feel that things are dysfunctional here in Washington, D.C. That's not a newsworthy statement. But one of the things that I found in my experience is what you need to do are find the places where common ground exists and work on those and build the muscles for the harder issues. And you do that in many ways. I had very specific ways I did it as secretary, including a breakfast every 8 weeks of all of the appropriators and authorizers for HHS, which is a lot because we cut across so many different things. But have everybody, Republicans, Democrat, ranking, minority, Senate, House, everybody together. But the rule of the breakfast, only common ground. And so the issues that we discussed, opioids, global health security, those things. And similarly in higher education, I think we need to look for those spaces. And I think we're on one right now that we've talked about a lot, which is federal funding being able to come during other periods of time to create the flexibility we need to help many of those students to completion. But part of what I think helps the relationship is, are we all on the same page on the basic of what we're trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
And in healthcare, one of the things tried to drive that to 3 simple phrases that actually kind of translate to higher education. Can we all agree that what we want in higher education is affordability, access, and quality? Can we all agree? Because once you have agreement on the goal, then you drive the conversation to the substantive things that will get you there. And so as we have this question of, those are some of the things that I think could improve our relationship between the sector and the federal government and state governments, because I think it extends to the state level, as you were reflecting, Danielle.
I think there are a lot of points of which there's agreement across the aisle,
Yes.
especially when you think about reinstituting summer Pell, right? This was something that just seemed like a very simple thing. Let's make sure that Pell grants are afforded in the fall, spring, and summer semester for a lot of students who need that aid. And you saw Congress and the Department of Education and everyone rally around this, and they were able to get it done. So there are more issues that I feel that there could be similar agreement on. The idea of credentialing is one of those things, trying to be very smart and deliberate in how you create a system that is supportive of short-term credentialing, but also very much aware that there will not always be good actors in that space, and how you hold them accountable to assure that they don't, blindly take taxpayer money without providing any kind of benefit to students.
Andy, and turning to thinking about how people are responding to the current context, and we're seeing a number of marches emerge over the last year to 18 months. We're seeing scientists, the scientific community, out there and marching, and record numbers of scientists also are running for public office here in the US, and more efforts being made at communicating the importance of scientific research to the general public. So 2 questions about this. What do you think's driving the energy and activity behind this, and what can the broader community learn from these efforts?
And I was one of them. I was on the Mall in the pouring rain little less than a year ago in the March for Science. There'll be another March for Science, a year anniversary in New York City in a couple of weeks' time as well. And what's driving it? I think a number of factors. Clearly, the disdain in certain circles for science, for data, for evidence as it applies to not only policy making but also other parts of life. That's certainly raised the level of concern among many scientists and wider groups as well. I think also the potential threat, as we've seen clearly, the potential threat to science funding in this country. I think one of the things that we've barely touched upon this morning is the role of American universities in creating the world's greatest research infrastructure, and the contributions that university-based research makes to American society in so many different ways. You know, you quoted earlier on, Sue, that comment, that ludicrous comment of the Oxford-educated Michael Gove, that the British public has had enough of experts. You know, well, let's ask Mr. Gove whether he will be saying that as he's wheeled in for open heart surgery and he encounters his surgeon. You know, is he interested in an expert? You know, and you know, in so many ways, the role of research in this country, and indeed in Western Europe as well, has been so critical. And for me, it's something that the March for Science was a validation, a strong statement among wonderfully diverse groups and multi-generations walking down the Mall and demonstrating that science matters, and to undermine the robust funding structure for science in this country. I'm pleased to say that our worst fears weren't realized, although certainly some parts of the funding infrastructure were quite badly affected, but certainly the NIH wasn't, and that's a very good thing. But certainly I don't think these marches will disappear, and in some ways I think it's a good thing that they don't, because it's important for all of us to be reminded of the critical importance of science.
We've had a question which is looking at philanthropy in an interesting way, asking what role does philanthropy play in this discussion? And Danielle, I'm looking at you, and we see, I mean, there are every day of the week in this country, I think it's true to say, there are magnificent exemplars of people who've chosen to invest in education because of their passion, because of their commitment, because they want to make things happen that's transformative to society. Often those are heralded. There are occasions when they're profoundly criticized. Do you think it plays any part in this narrative, or might it play more of a part in a positive way?
I do wonder sometimes if when states see large donations to certain flagships or regionals, then they feel okay shirking their responsibility to appropriate dollars to those schools. Not saying it's a definite correlation there, but the private sector has an important role, but it is also important that as a society, state and federal policy support universities in a meaningful way. And sometimes I do wonder if, if we rely too much on private dollars to the exclusion of state and federal support, then that kind of allows them to not really care too much. Because you can always have endowments, I think, is a really good example of this. There is a lot of confusion as to how endowments operate, what they do, how schools use them, and I think we saw that a lot in this tax bill that recently happened. There was a lot of confusion as to how schools use them to support financial aid. There were a lot of schools that are included in that list there that have used an inordinate amount of money in order to support financial aid at their universities, and still they were a part of this list that made no sense whatsoever. I think the important thing, and it's really interesting to see, is that even though that bill passed, there's still a fight. And a part of that fight is making sure that colleges and universities claim the narrative about how endowments work, how they help support not only students but faculty, operations, and everything else. And it's sad that it had to come after the fact. Perhaps some of that should have happened ahead of time. I don't know if that would have made much of a difference, because that provision kind of came out of nowhere in a lot of ways, because there was no real sense of what the purpose was other than to find a way to pay for corporate tax breaks. Was that too honest?
Yeah.
So I like all that. I think for those of us of a certain age, it probably was less of a surprise than it
exactly
played out to be. We've been hearing this for a while and just never thought it would happen. And I think the endowment issue may be kind of a focal point for this broader conversation. Is that I think that there was an implicit understanding on our side that we were doing the right thing with endowments, and that the donors who gave to us were doing the right thing, not just by the institution, but by society because of what they were supporting. And a belief that everybody else understood that too. I think what was surprising in the debate was how, exactly your point, Danielle, that people really don't have a good sense of what endowments are, how they come to be, and how they're spent. And that goes into surprisingly, shockingly high levels of the debate about the tax bill. At a less elevated place in our surveys and the research that we're doing, majority of people believe that tuition dollars fund endowments. And if that's what you think, then think of all of the other things that go along with that. It means that the money that I'm paying out of my hard-earned income is somehow going into this abstract place to do things that I don't care about. That's what taxes do too, but that's a different question. So I think that we didn't understand the lack of understanding about endowments, and I think that the unfortunate thing for institutions, I think the endowment tax is a horrible idea. We have opposed it from beginning to end and will continue to do so on principled grounds. But institutions that aren't Harvard, that aren't Yale, that aren't Princeton, are being colored with the same brush. And so there is an overgeneralizing about elite institutions, rich institutions, suspiciously funded institutions that I'm afraid is bleeding over into other institutions as well.
Yes, Sylvia.
I do think this is yet another place where it's important for us to think about what is the factual difference and the substantive point of difference in the endowment space. So completely agree with everything that Danielle and Ted stated. And this is not a position, I think it's understanding who you're talking, why people are saying things that they're saying. So some people express that when one thinks about an endowment and one thinks about all these students and this debt and the cost, that you shouldn't sit on $30 billion of unused money. And so it's actually, the argument isn't about what is going towards an endowment or how an endowment is being used in the day-to-day. It actually is the question, calling the question of, is it right for just 5%, which is basically holding an endowment steady, but most of the universities did pretty well last year, so we can do the math if you earned 10% in the 5. And the question that some people are asking is a question of, should you spend it down? And I think this gets to broader philanthropic issues. When we look at how philanthropic entities are being set up today, so Atlantic Philanthropies decided, in the UK, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world, at that time when they were set up, second only to Gates, it was set up to spend the money down. Mm-hmm. And so it's a different philosophy. And so I do think we in higher education, because we do have endowments and they are an important way that we fund and think about it, I think we have to hear the question. I'm not sure that I'm not suggesting an answer, but I think it is, again, important to get to the next level of, is this just a communications issue, or do we have a disagreement on a point of substance?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all of those things, let me respond as a former provost of Yale. The issues around endowment, they have been discussed for quite some time. But of course, let's not forget that, you, Sylvia, I, and Sue have a connection to a university, Oxford University, that was founded in the 11th century and has existed for nearly 900 years. Yale is 325 years, Harvard heading towards 400 years. These are institutions that have existed for centuries and will exist for centuries. The endowment spending rate, much discussed in public, is there to ensure intergenerational fairness, that we don't spend it down for the benefit of this generation, but those funds are there for the generations hundreds of years in the future. And I will say, for me, this is another example of the issue that Ted focused on a second ago, that we have a rhetoric of one kind focused on the cost of higher education, while the policies and the changes that are instituted have the exact opposite. They make higher education more expensive. The endowment tax is removing funds that would be used to support education, to support research, and especially to support the extremely generous financial aid packages that Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford are able to offer. And I say all of this, NYU, our endowment isn't at the level that reaches the threshold for taxation, but this taxation is removing money that would have gone to critical educational purposes, including financial aid.
And to add to that, arguably there is now potentially the disincentive for institutions to continue to successfully engage those who might give significantly to endowments in case you get above that level.
Yes, I've made it an aspiration at NYU to get an endowment so we can be taxed. That's our aspiration.
I'm with you on that.
A lovely question that's come in, quoting from Martin Luther King Jr., "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, this is the goal of a true education. Is this not fundamentally the story that we should be addressing, perhaps even before training graduates to be ready for the job market?" Any thoughts?
So
How
to-
can one comment after
agree.
such a powerful statement?
It's a very powerful statement.
Can I take a page from Sylvia's book? So
Please.
I think that's right. I think that finding common ground between that and people who say jobs, jobs, jobs is important. And I think that there is stable, intellectually responsible common ground there. And I think we've all given this speech, right? This is the one about, and we talked about it earlier, Andy talked about it, is what are the skills that are needed to thrive economically, personally, in terms of a community and a democracy. They really come together pretty remarkably around King's vision.
And Danielle, how do we reach those whose minds may need to change in terms of their perspective of higher education?
Politically, it's engagement in part, just making sure that, politicians understand the significance of colleges and universities, and trying not to be painted with a broad brush. And that's not to say there are lots of people on Capitol Hill who get it, who completely understand and get it. I know that's hard to believe, but there are those, and making those relationships with those who are on the fence but can certainly start to consider the importance of their local school, of their regional, their flagship, all of those kinds of things, and kind of helping that to be the seed for a broader understanding of the significance of the sector is important. As far as the public, telling these sorts of stories, acknowledging that, yes, I understand that you are concerned about the costs. I understand that you are concerned about the viability of this education, and I understand all those things, but I want you to understand what we can offer, how we can bridge your concerns with our value proposition. And I think that's another part of just relationship building.
And I think, and Ted referred this earlier on, I think the potential of engaging alumni in that space, when we look at approximately a third of the population of this country have an undergraduate degree, if one could engage that huge number of people in telling the story, that would be very powerful.
I think as we think about the question of the story that we tell and how it fits into the broader conversation in our nation, in our world, I think we've touched on 2 points that I think are important as we consider that context. And one is your comments about expertise in science made me think a little bit about the death of expertise, the new book, and the questions of how people relate to expertise. And I think that's a broader context that we're in for the rest of the nation. And so how we actually think about the return, it's exactly what you said. The example, I was reading a little summary of the book, and it said the example that the author uses is when you have 104.5 temperature, you're for expertise.
Yeah.
You are for expertise. And so the question of that articulation, which the March, I think, helps people reflect and recognize. And then I think the second piece that's important is the importance of the role of the citizen in making our democracy strong, and the voice of the citizen, and the ability of the citizen to be attached to substance and fact and have voice. And so these are two things that are at that broader level that are happening in the nation that I think are very important context for how our specific story of the value we add in higher education is heard.
I want to agree wholeheartedly with Danielle, and this is an issue that we absolutely must engage with. But I also think we need to be careful on a morning like this not to engage in too much self-flagellation, because we are living through a period where all institutions in society are distrusted. We are living through the corporations, politics itself. Why are we surprised that education is also falling into this realm? We're also living through a period that none of us quite understand of the way in which social media is influencing public perception, how social media is influencing politics. It seems sometimes that the world of social media has unleashed the mob, and we can't control it, and we don't know how to control it. And certainly as public opinion, we seek to influence public opinion. That's something I think we need to give more thought to. And I do think in higher education we have a particular challenge, and it's something that we all face. Those of us in universities like AU, like NYU, like Oxford, like Harvard, like Yale, Berkeley, Michigan, we are highly selective institutions. We discriminate. We don't like to say it, but we discriminate on the basis of ability, on the basis of intelligence. And so a university like Yale, what's its admit rate? 6%? 7%? So that means at any one time there are 7% of happy families around Yale and 93% of very unhappy, disappointed. And we deal with the politics of disappointment of those who aren't admitted to our institutions. And, is that something inherent in our selective higher education system? Yes. Do other countries tackle it by having no selectivity at all? Yes, France, Germany, Italy being examples. But I also think we've got to build that into the serious response and the important response that we all need to have to the question we've been talking about today. How do we affect public opinion?
So I'm going to pick up your point and lift us out of disappointment as we come into the final few moments of our conversation, into asking you each if you could identify in no more than 2 sentences, how did your higher education experience change and transform your life? I hope the answer isn't disappointment. Danielle, can I start with you?
Okay. NYU did a great deal for me. So did Columbia. Yes.
Glad to hear it.
I came across amazing professors at NYU who broadened my perspective of global politics in a way that I will always be forever in their debt. I still have all of my college textbooks in my library at home. There is a whole section just dedicated to Afro-Caribbean politics, which was a core class, which was amazing to me. I can't say enough about that. I'm a first-generation college goer. My parents are working class people. We did not have the resources for me to go to college. And I have benefited from many of those programs that I write about. So I do so writing with the knowledge of what it feels like to have to take on debt, to need Pell Grants, to need SEOG, to need a Perkins loan, and what it feels like when you don't get that funding and how much more you have to work. And so I hope that my other colleagues in the media also are paying much attention to the impact of what we write and who we write for and being able to tell those stories. And I'm thankful that my college education made me aware of that and always keeping that at the core of what I do.
Thank you. Ted, how did education change your life?
So I loved college so much I decided never to leave. I think actually captures it, and I've wandered a little bit, but the opening of my mind, the ability to read critically, to think from points of view different than my own, all of those were new experiences for me when I came to college. They were liberating, they were enlivening, and they were scary as heck. And the scary as heck part was the part that made me stay. It was just the right place to be because I knew that I was going to continue to grow.
Thank you, Sylvia.
I'm a second generation, both immigrant in terms of my family coming from another country and second generation, but I'm Greek, and so this idea of education was the key to everything, and that's why folks came. That's why my grandparents all came to this place. And the idea that you can take those tools that you learn, that critical thinking, that exposure to so many different points of view, the confidence it builds to do those scary things that Ted was mentioning, and then get the opportunity to serve at the highest levels of your country and in some of the largest organizations in the world. And then be able to come full circle and be back at an institution to contribute. Like, that's what education can do. And I think, that's why our commitment to do it for everyone, I think everyone that's a part of this conversation, I believe that's all why we come to it.
Thank you. Andy?
I think for me, education did something that I often say I hope it does for all students. And I'll quote the former poet laureate in Britain, Andrew Motion, who said a wonderful thing about education, that the most important teacher in his life walked into his head and turned the lights on. And for me, that's what education did for me. It's what I hope it does to all of the students at NYU. It clearly did for Danielle in her period at NYU. And of course, in my own case, the lights were turned on for a particular subject and a love of learning about that subject. I had a professor at Cambridge, a man who died just 2 weeks ago at the age of 93. His name was Sir Alan Battersby, and he was the man more than any other who walked into my head and turned the lights on and made me realize that chemistry, believe it or not, organic chemistry is a beautiful subject. It is a subject that can become a lifelong fascination, even to the extent my wife is often appalled. You know, I take chemistry books on vacation. You know, I don't read mysteries or novels. I read chemistry books, and that's something that I had, and I hope very much an experience of students coming to NYU is that we get into their head, turn all the lights on, and have them engaged with the world, the culture of the world, the political challenges of the world, the public service opportunities, as Sylvia has said, of the world, but to that connection through lifelong of the power of their mind and the opportunities they have to never, ever stop learning. And certainly the one thing I learned in my education, Sue, is that no academic ever answers anything in 2 sentences. So,
Okay, well, my final question is going to be maybe 1.5 sentences, which is, I think for those who wish to say, the next hour is a seminar on organic chemistry. So,
a pleasure.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Before I sum up, one final question from each of you, and I do encourage you to be brief. From all we have said, I'll start with you, Sylvia. What is the most important thing that the higher education community can do in the next 6 months to reclaim our story? If there's one thing you think we should be doing, what is it?
Focus on 3 things that are matters of fact that we should get high quality communication on. Focus on the 3 areas where it is a substantive issue and start the work on those.
Thank you. Danielle?
Be willing to be honest about your shortcomings and how you intend to overcome them.
Andy?
I'm going to be provocative. Don't beat ourselves up. We are doing a fabulous job. Society has never needed higher education more than it does now. And actually saying that and saying it louder is one of our key necessities.
And Ted, you are not celebrating your 100th birthday, you're much younger than that, but AC is celebrating its 100th birthday over the coming days. What is the most important thing you think we should be doing over the next 6 months?
So as we turn into our 2nd century, this debate is front and center. I don't want us to beat ourselves up. Our enterprise is transformational. That's 2 sentences already. Comma, semicolon. And there are issues of substance, and we need to be brave about talking about them, and we need to be innovative in addressing them.
Thank you. We began our conversation this morning acknowledging AC's 100th anniversary, noting that 1918, at the end of the Great War, was a time for rebuilding and rededication to education as a means for transforming lives and society. As we turn our minds, as Ted just did, to the next century, what will our sector look like in 2118? Will our universities be physical places? What will the breadth of post-secondary education offering look like? What will the global higher education landscape look like? And I hope that that is the subject of a future debate. But what we do now really matters. And as our speakers have indicated, we have considerable challenges and at the same time myriad opportunities. And long before 2118, with leadership from within our sector and outside of it, I look forward to a stronger and broader understanding of and engagement with and from our sector across society. We have focused today on the challenges within and for higher education. We know that education is a key to the broad challenges that the world faces on every front. I would like to invite you all to continue this conversation, and I know that ACE and American University and NYU and CASE and our thousands of members throughout the world look forward to working with you all on reclaiming our story. And CASE has a number of resources available at our website should you wish to look to do just that. But may I finish off by joining me in thanking our magnificent panel, Ted Mitchell, Andy Hamilton, Danielle Douglas-Gabriel, and Sylvia Burwell. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.